Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this new session of the research seminar of this School of Economics and Business Studies. Today's session is going to be given by Professor Engelbert Stockhammer, who is currently professor at the University of Kingston. And the title of the conference, of the presentation, is Rebalancing the Euro Area, the Cost of Internal Devaluation. And so first of all, I would like to thank very much Engelbert for accepting our invitation. It is a real pleasure to have Engelbert here in Madrid. So we've known each other for a few years now, and I'm really glad that he accepted to come to Madrid. This presentation, or the participation of Professor Stockhammer, was posed by the Department of Applied Economics Studies, so I would also like to thank the department for the proposal. Okay, as in previous presentations, we'll be having speakers' presentation initially for about 45 minutes, and after that you will have the opportunity to ask him questions related to the topic of the seminar. And in case I would ask you not to interrupt him unless there is something very specific question you need to ask before he goes ahead. And I would like to very briefly to give you a short biographical details about Engelbert's trajectory as an academic. As I said, he's currently professor of economics at the University of Kingston in the UK. I could say that he's an excellent or very good example of a new generation of post-Keynesian economists who are doing a lot of theoretical but also empirical work on different traditional Keynesian topics. I believe he obtained his PhD at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the United States. And his main research areas include macroeconomics, financial systems, and of course political economy. He is also a research associate at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's also a member of the coordination committee of the research network Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies, and also the committee of the Post-Keynesian Economics Study Group. Well, he has published widely in academic journals, in spite of his young age, say. And basically, most of his work has been on the determinants of unemployment, on distribution-led demand regimes, and on the very friendly topic of financialization. He's also the author of the book titled The Rise of Unemployment in Europe, which came out in 2004, and co-editor of 4 different books. Macroeconomic Policies on Shaky Foundations with their mainstream economics, Heterodox Economy, which was published in German in 2009. More recently, a modern guide to Keynesian economics and economic policies in 2011, and wage-led growth, an equitable strategy for economic recovery, which came out last year in Indirect. Okay. Again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and please go ahead. The word is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Alfonso, for the kind introduction. Yes, I want to talk about the rebalancing of the euro area and the costs that involves if it is to be achieved by internal devaluation. And I maybe should say 2 words of qualifications before I go into. The first is, while I was correctly introduced as a post-Keynesian economist, I am a post-Keynesian economist, this paper is actually not particularly post-Keynesian. It's a Keynesian paper, but it's really more an old Keynesian than a post-Keynesian paper. If anyone is interested in the details, I'll be happy to discuss that. The second is, I have to apologize that this is a somewhat old paper. not in absolute terms. It will be coming out shortly in a journal, but it was written by now 3 years ago. And when you're discussing the euro crisis, 3 years is a long time. So the data and the analysis here will be based on data that end in 2011. Therefore, they are not all the way up to date. There will be some sort of extensions with recent data that I'll present at the end that are not in the paper. However, the reason why I wanted to present it in Spain was just because of the topic. And it's sort of an analytical paper that has an econometric core and talks about the cost of internal devaluation. And thus, despite the fact that it's not all the way up to date, I thought I wanted to present it in this setting. Now the paper is about internal devaluation. Internal devaluation isn't a very popular term these days anymore, but 3 years ago you could actually read it quite frequently. In a way, the policy debate has shifted from wage adjustment somewhat more to austerity and the role of public policy in terms of fiscal expenditures, not so much about the issue of wages restraint on the surface, but of course under the heading of labor market flexibility, it's still up there. And in 2010, 2011, the European Commission used the wording internal devaluation repeatedly, by which, of course, they meant wage cuts in the deficit countries, in the southern European countries. So what motivated this paper is the rather down-to-earth questions if the European Commission and these other people were serious. Serious by trying to get rid of the current account deficits that the southern European countries were having at the outbreak of the crisis, say 2007, 2008. If you were to get rid of that by means of wage cuts, how much of a reduction in GDP do you actually need to get the amount of wage cuts to get rid of these current account imbalances? That is the question that I had in mind, but that we had in mind. It's, I should have said earlier, the paper is co-authored with Dimitris Soteropoulos, tellingly a colleague from Greece, with whom I discussed these issues at the time. And what we will be doing in the paper is we're going to estimate a very simple 3-equation system. It's sort of old Keynesian, or by old Keynesian essentially means the equations that we'll be estimating can be found in any intermediate macroeconomics textbook. In that sense, it's actually not a particularly heterodox model, it's actually a fairly standard model. So we'll be estimating a current account equation. The current account is a function of demand on the one hand and costs, so unit labor costs on the other hand. There will be Phillips curve as a function of unit labor costs, and then there will be an Okun's law relation which links output on the one hand and the unemployment rate on the other hand. And once you put these together, you can look at the total effects of a change in output, which then will have a direct effect because a lower level of output will mean less imports, but it will also have an indirect effect because lower level of output means higher unemployment, that means lower wages, therefore lower unit labor costs, and therefore increased competitiveness. And what we're interested in is if you look at those 3 simple equations, what is the total amount of loss in output that you need in order to get rid of the current account deficits that we had at the outbreak of the crisis. Now we're going to estimate all of that by a simple panel for the euro area countries. We're going to play with different time periods, different samples, but essentially we'll be focusing on the 99 to 2011, which is the euro area, but some samples will be long and some will be only about the recession years. So in a way, I'm not asking a country-specific question. I'm not asking what it will cost Spain or Greece or Italy to get rid of their current account deficit in terms of output. But what I'm asking is, if you take a stylized average European country, which is what the panel of the Euro area countries is giving me, it's giving me a hypothetical average European countries. If that hypothetically average European countries had those 7–8% of GDP current account deficits, how much of an output reduction do you need in order to get rid of the current account deficit? And the answer that we're getting is you'll need 1 or 2 Great Depressions in order to rebalance. Yeah, so these are the statistics that illustrate once again that this is a dated paper. So we have the current account deficits in 2007, and for the CHIPS countries, they were on average 8.4% of GDP. By 2011, they had already reduced to half of that. In the meantime, the current account is essentially balanced. And as I'm sure you're aware, big parts of this discussion are arguing that the reason for one reason for these current account imbalances is the divergent developments in unit labor costs, in particular the fact that German unit labor costs were essentially flat in the Euro period up to the crisis, whereas a lot of southern European countries had substantial increases in unit labor costs. Yeah, so with the argument that I'm making, we do not at all want to say that unit labor costs is all that the Euro crisis is about. It's a sort of an intervention in a particular aspect of the debate around the Euro crisis. Obviously, one could discuss sovereign debt, one could discuss household debt, so there's all sorts of other things that are going on. We are picking out one particular aspect because a big part of policy reactions, at least a few years ago, were justified with respect to that aspect. Yeah, so again, we're not saying that we're explaining all the Euro crisis. We're saying if the current account, if rebalancing the current accounts is part of the Euro crisis, then it makes sense to look at what the output costs of achieving that is. Yeah. And so in a way what we are doing is we are picking up on a earlier literature around the Phillips curve. And in particular at the time when the ECB was founded, there was a lot of studies on Phillips curves and on the Phillips curves in the Euro area. And the Phillips curves, one of the things that they give you is what is called the sacrifice ratio. How much output cost you need, how much output reduction you need in order to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. And the funny thing is, all these debates around internal devaluation, even the contributions of the ECB or the European Commission, actually did not refer to these studies on the Phillips curves. And part of what this paper wants to do is remind people that if you're looking at this older literature, you will very quickly find that the output cost that the Phillips curve literature suggests that rebalancing will be enormous. They will be 10, 20, 30, 40% of GDP, meaning you get huge numbers out of that literature, whereas a lot of the policy debate presented internal devaluation as if it were a relatively smooth and painless process. So again, we're gonna have, because we're gonna estimate 3 equations, which you're gonna see in a minute, we're gonna have 2 channels, one direct, one indirect. The direct effect is, in a way, the partial effect in the net export function. So reducing output will have a negative effect on net exports. And it will have an indirect effect. And again, the causality of that indirect effect is lower output means higher unemployment, means lower wage growth, means lower unit labor costs, and that affects competitiveness and therefore net exports. Therefore, our framework is a bit more general than the Phillips curve because it has a somewhat different focus. The Phillips curve channel, in a way, is the indirect second channel that you have in there. Our framework is a bit broader, and therefore by design, because I have indirect as well as direct effects compared to the Phillips curve literature, we will always get lower sacrifice ratios, not higher sacrifice ratios. The 3 equations that we'll be working with because we're estimating panels, we're not experimenting a whole lot with the lake structure here, and we have a fairly short time dimension. So the behavioral equations are fairly simple. It's the change in the current account as percent of GDP that will be a function of GDP growth on the one hand and the growth rate of unit labor costs. Again, most intermediate macro textbooks before they start micro-founding things would have such an equation in there. We'll have a Phillips curve, a wage Phillips curve to be precise, so its unit labor costs are dependent variable, and that will be a function of import prices, of unemployment, and on unit labor costs. So in a way it has a external element, it's the import costs, it has the unemployment aspect, and it has a lagged effect of unit labor costs. And Robert Gordon called it the triangular Phillips curve. And then there's an Okun's law relation that's fairly close to Okun's original paper, which is the change in the unemployment rate as a change in the rate of growth. The Okun's law relation is the least interesting of the behavioral equations that we're estimating. And then the final two lines give you an idea on how we add up those things, and the last line indicates again that we have the direct effect of output on the current account, which is related to the A1, and then there's this longer indirect effect, the effect of income on unemployment, of unemployment on unit labor costs, and unit labor costs on the current account. We're going to do a panel analysis for all the Euro area countries. The Euro area, I should say, were the Euro area at the time, so it's the Euro area 12. In the meantime, it's of course a bit larger. We're using annual data. All our data are from AMECO, from the European Commission. And we're going to be looking in particular at three versions, three samples of our panel. The one that at the time we thought was most interesting was the Euro area panel, is 99 to 2011. We also take a somewhat longer period that starts in 1990. The 1990 obviously is arbitrary where we started, because it's pre-Euro. The important thing is it has the EMS crisis 92-93 in there, so in terms of variation of the data it does make a big difference. And there is a discussion about asymmetries or non-linearities in the Phillips curve, and in particular there's an argument that Phillips curves have a different slope in recession and non-recession years. Therefore we're also estimating everything, all our equations only for recession years, which of course will reduce our sample quite a bit. But it does indeed give quite different values. The relevant orders of magnitude are essentially halved in the recession years. So we do find evidence that there's non-linearities in these equations. Why are we using the panel? Well, because we thought it would be interesting to look at it. There's no deeper truth in the panel. Again, we thought it was interesting to look at the panel precisely because it gives you an average of the European countries, and we did not want to get into a debate on whether a particular coefficient in, say, the Phillips curve or the export equation would be particularly high or low, say, in Greece, or particularly low in Spain, or high in Italy, or something like that. Yeah? We did want to look at it in a way as the European Commission is presenting its proposal to Europe, to European countries. So in a way, what it's proposing, I think legitimately should be evaluated in terms of what it would do to an average European country. And that's the sort of question that we are asking. Now, there's also a technical reason that speaks for the panel in our case. Now, the time series approach, a country-specific approach, would be appropriate if you thought that countries were very different from each other, but would be relatively stable in terms of their coefficients over time. Whereas the panel is more attractive if you think that, well, maybe the countries are not that different overall, but crucial parameters will change a lot over time. And the variable, the parameters that I suspected would change a lot, and indeed we do find that they change a lot, is that because of European integration and because of the common currency, at least that's my hypothesis, the net export equation is changing. And in particular, net exports become a lot more sensitive to unit labor costs over time, which is not fundamentally surprising if you think of that those countries effectively move from a system with temporarily fixed exchange rates to a system with permanently fixed exchange rates. I mean, in such a system you would expect unit labor cost to become a more important factor because market participants know that the exchange rate can't intermediate it. Right? So that would be the technical reason why I think that in our case the panel makes more sense, again because it allows us to look at shorter time intervals that we couldn't estimate on the country level. Yeah, a few words on the literature. Now the current accounts have attracted quite a bit of attention, and in the meantime I think that there's less being published on it, but around the 2008 to 2010 or so, there was a lot of papers coming out there, and roughly they fall into two groups. One, and that is the literature that's much closer to what we are doing, is essentially taking this approach that, well, if you have current account deficits or surpluses, it must be due either to competitiveness or to growth and demand. And then you can extend it for the growth of the trade partners. So in a way that's essentially a behavioral equation, or adding up 2-3 behavioral equations. The other part of the literature is much more theory guided and wants to, typically neoclassical theory, and essentially derives the current account balance from the savings and investment decisions. And the savings investment decisions are then derived from the rate of time preference, from the demographic structure, and so on. So these are supposed to be underlying structural variables that determine savings and investment decision, but it's not a behavioral export and import function anymore. And sometimes then, less in the theory section of these papers, but in the empirical section, then issues like corruption or the depth of the financial market, the size of the balance sheet of banks also enter these equations. So I'm not as convinced that it's really fully consistent with the neoclassical framework. But either way, what we're doing is we're taking the first approach that looks as competitiveness versus growth. What is interesting, that's a footnote here, what's interesting, if you look at that literature, there's surprisingly little on capital flows and current account imbalances. I mean, if people talk about the current account, they're essentially thinking of a trade relation. But of course, the current account is on the one hand a trade relation, but on the other hand, it's the net position of capital flows. And it could also be that the current account is really driven by capital flows. The capital flows adjust the real exchange rates, and thereby, as a side effect, you get the net exports adjusting in order to fit the net capital flow position. But again, at least when we did the literature review 2-3 years ago, we didn't find much in that direction. And I think it would be worth exploring. Yeah, that's a sort of the tables. I presume you can't read that anyways. You can read it if you have printed out the paper. These are our overview of the relevant literature, but I think I did discuss them. Now that's the current account equation that we get. And again, it has the structure that I will always be looking at 3 samples. So that's the euro area sample, that's a euro area plus half EMS in there, starting from 1990. And then we have the recession years only. Therefore, our observations will be about 150, 250, and 35 in the last one. So the last one sort of is at the borderline of observations where you would want to bother running regressions. But again, the results are for some equations quite different, and thus it is quite interesting. And again, the specifications is minimalistic, and I actually couldn't, we do have a constant in here, as we are differentiating everything, we could actually do without the constant, but as it was significant, so be it. What you see is that typically our coefficients are highly statistically significant, in this case, except for growth for the recession years. What we do find is that while in our two samples the growth coefficient on the current account is fairly stable, -13, -14, the coefficient on unit labor costs actually changes a lot. It was -10 in the longer sample, and it doubles in the shorter sample. So that's the argument that I made, that because of monetary unification, you would expect exports and imports to become more sensitive to costs, and again, that is what we find. And if you do rolling regressions and plots how it changes over time, you very clearly see how it increases, whereas the GDP growth is fairly stable. In this case, we get roughly consistent effects with the recession period for our unit labor costs. And the unit labor costs are the one that we're going to use later on. Yeah, we experimented with other specifications, but as this is this is a panel, I'm not convinced whether the ECM model like is really that useful. There has been some debate on whether the imbalances have been cost-driven or demand-driven. In particular, Brigitte Young and Willy Semmler, two Germans, have argued that moderate wage increase in Germany have led, they reject the argument that wage suppression in Germany is to be blamed for the imbalances in Germany, across the euro area. This is not what we are finding. Yeah? We do find very clearly that unit labor costs do have an effect, and if you wanted, I could also show you results for Germany that illustrates that also for Germany unit labor costs do have a statistically significant effect on their export position. So I would think that their argument that German wage policy is not related to the trade imbalances in the euro area is not supported by effects. If we take our coefficients and look at the and multiply the coefficients with the actual change in the underlying variables in order to make them comparable, we do roughly find that about half of the imbalances are explained by costs and half of them are explained by demand divergence, which intuitively should make some sense. I mean, you would expect the much stronger growth performance in the southern European countries in the decade before the crisis compared to Germany to push up the imports and thus create trade deficits. But there are some countries, in particular Italy and Portugal, some southern European countries, that actually had a growth performance not all that different from Germany. So it's hard to believe that their current account deficits were due just to growth factors. There must be a role for costs, in my view at least. Yeah, then comes the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is essentially a version of Gordon's triangular Phillips curve. There are some minor differences in the way how we set it up. We have the unemployment rate in there instead of the output gap, but other than that, that's roughly it. Much of the Gordon's triangular Phillips curve is sort of not quite sure whether he would use the term old Keynesian, but pragmatic Keynesian Phillips curve. Much of the more recent discussion has moved to the new Keynesian Phillips curves. And the new Keynesian Phillips curves sort of buy into rational expectations, and therefore for them it's all about the expected price level versus the actual price level. It's sort of, Gordon in his equation doesn't care much about the expectations. It's about domestic factors, it's about time dependency, the lagged variable, and it's about external factors. It's not about that's what people expected and that's what inflation happened to be. And the new Keynesian models are all excited about those price expectations and sort of downplay the role of the other variable. And now they're sometimes called forward-looking new Keynesian Phillips curves. They tend to not perform all that well in practice, and therefore the new Keynesians have created the hybrid new Keynesian Phillips curve, which sort of wants to have it both ways and thus has all its expectation terms, but also uses lagged variables just in case that there are some non-rational individuals in the economy and they look at past values rather than properly optimizing and forward-looking. Again, what we are doing is in the old Keynesian. That was the tables with the detailed literature again. These are our results for the Phillips curves. Again, it's a wage Phillips curve, but that again is actually fairly standard in the literature. You have price Phillips curve as well as wage Phillips curve. We again have our three samples as we discussed. And we do find that in all specifications we get statistically significant results and we get the signs that we expect because we are having this panel and we're having little to play with on the time dimensions. We don't get very few weird results. I mean, essentially all our results are consistent with what we expect. And we do find again some difference between, in particular looking at the coefficient of the unit labor cost, we do find some difference in the coefficients between the first sample and the recession years. I mean, compared to our baseline here, it moves from 0.4 to 0.7 something, it almost doubles in value. So that indeed might be interpreted as an indication that values are different in recession years. Now, this equation that we're estimating here is much in line with some of the literature on the Phillips curves, and we are quoting here a OECD working paper which finds that, and they also had a panel approach and sort of tested down carefully on whether you can actually pool those countries and found the majority you can pool. And they find the single equation results suggest that for 16 out of 21 countries you can actually pool these. Also there are some countries where the pooling restriction is rejected statistically, but there is a high degree of similarity. And the order of magnitude of an effect that they're getting is they're getting a sacrifice ratio of 3.75. Now the sacrifice ratio, the way they define it is years of output loss for 1% inflation. In other words, you need almost 4% output loss or 1% output loss for 4 years, to reduce inflation by 1%. Now, if you take that number and you do a very quick back of the envelope calculation. Now, the unit labor costs of the southern European countries in 2008 were, compared to 99 when the euro was introduced, were roughly, say, 20%, actually a bit more, 20% higher than in Germany. If the southern European countries were to bring down the unit labor costs with the OECD's sacrifice ratio of 3-something%, and they would have to get rid of 20% of unit labor cost divergence, that would knock off an astounding 60-70% of GDP. Yeah? So that's what I mean by saying that the policy recommendation of internal devaluation, if you look at it from the viewpoint of this Phillips curve literature, and I mean, this is one paper that's particularly comparable to what we are doing, but there's a lot of literature on Phillips curve, and it tends to give you these orders of magnitudes. You get huge output losses that would be implied in the internal devaluation strategy. So finally, we estimate an Ockhams law relation, and because everything went so smooth and there also wasn't much of non-linearities in here, we kept it simple, so it's the change in the unemployment rate as a function of the growth in GDP, and we're essentially also getting a coefficient of 0.25, which is very close to Ockham's original 0.3. So it's very unspectacular and stable here. And yes, then we put things together. So these are our equations. And if we are doing the math of putting those equations together, what you get is that roughly for 1 percentage points of GDP growth, you get 1/5 of a percentage points of current account deficit less. And that is for a baseline sample, which is the 99 to 2011. There's another way to illustrate that. So for our two samples, 99, 2011 and 1990, 2011, we get almost exactly the same output, in a way, current account sacrifice ratio, if you want to call it that way. However, if you look at the detail, the composition on how you get that is actually quite different, but the outcome is the same. Mind you, if we wanted to get rid of the, I think it was 8.4% of the average Southern European current account deficit, that would require a horrifying 47% of GDP decline, meaning you would have to halve GDP. The estimations for the recessions give you a substantially lower estimate, basically half the value, and a big part of the reason is that the Phillips curve coefficient is a lot higher in the recession years, and therefore we get a lower value. But even this lower value is about 23 or 24% of GDP. So in a way, what you have here is our lower bound estimate is 1 Great Depression. Our upper bound estimate is 2 Great Depressions. What you would need if you were to tackle current account deficits by means of internal devaluation. Yes, and then there's various other things that we played with, which I will not get into. Yeah, so what were our findings there? And that is called, so how bad will it be? Again, that's the point of view of 2011 when we wrote the paper. And we said that, well, the rebalancing would cost between 47 and 23% of GDP. just for comparison, if you just look at the OECD study that we have, and if you take those 20% that I gave you at an order of magnitude, you would even get a higher value. So we actually thought that what we found is not due to anything specific that we did, but is really what you get if you take a Phillips curve approach and if you take that approach seriously. So the question is, how bad has it been and how far are we off? Now, by 2013, and these are again the Ameco data, roughly the Southern European countries had balanced their current accounts. The question is, at what output cost has that come? And I'm once, and that's the Y0813, that's the ratio of how much GDP has improved 2013 compared to 2008, and you will see that in many countries it actually is negative, it's substantially below where we were. For Spain I get 6.7%. You could look at it from another way and say, well, that's taking the value of 2008 as the reference point. Now, what if countries had been growing at their trend? So let's do a very simple trend calculation. Let's take the 10 years prior to the crisis as the growth trend and look at the output gap that you would have relative to that. And that is the Y gap that you see in the last column. And then you do get values of -29 for Ireland and -40 for Greece and -23 for Spain. So in other words, if you take that perspective, you get values that don't look that far off from the calculations that you've seen. So what I've done here is, and that is not in the paper, that I did a day or two ago in preparation of this presentation, that is that's not a panel, that's just pure cross-country, so it's essentially the values that you've just seen in the table. That's, again, calculating now cross-country, the change in net export from 2008 to 2013, and the Y gap, which is the difference between actual GDP and the trend GDP as I defined it. And if you do a cross-country regression on that, you get a -0.4, which is roughly consistent with what I've seen. Now, if I do the same for GDP, I get a higher absolute number, which would mean a smaller sacrifice ratio. The corresponding values are the -0.2 and -0.4 that you're seeing here. So the first line of what you're seeing here is corresponding to this -0.4 and -0.7. So that would imply a smaller value, and that's for actual GDP, and that is relative to trend GDP, and that is in line with our recession scenario. So in that sense, I think while we're probably on the upper bound of the costs, I don't think that actual developments are inconsistent with what we had found a few years ago. Now, I presume I'm slowly running out of time.
No, but we have some 5 minutes left.
Yeah, excellent. This is the last slide. So why does one do such an exercise? It is an exercise in a way in an applied masochism, because one sees that the social costs or the economic costs of such a rebalancing strategy are enormous. For us, the consequence of that is that what Europe needs is a rebalancing strategy that does not put the burden on the deficit countries. Rather, you want a rebalancing strategy that puts the adjustment burden on the surplus countries. Because effectively, if you want to realign the unit labor costs, it's either the countries with the current account deficits that have to reduce their unit labor costs, or it's the countries with the current account surpluses that would have to in a way push for higher wage increases and thereby increase the unit labor costs. So the policy conclusion of that is that an internal devaluation strategy that puts the adjustment burden on the deficit countries is a strategy that requires between 1 and 2 Great Depression in the deficit countries. And instead of that, what you want is an inflationary package where the surplus countries are doing the adjustment. That would mean higher inflation in the euro area overall, thus it would require that the ECB is increasing its inflation targets, but in a way it would give the Southern European countries more room in stabilizing their economies without running against competitiveness constraints. Yes, or to put it less diplomatically, if Europe wants to get out of its present mess, what we need is higher wages. Sure. It's the very short version. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And so now we can open up a round of questions so that you have the opportunity to ask Engelbert questions about this critical topic for southern countries. So, who would like to start? Clara? Right.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting, your presentation. I would like to ask you to reflect upon a couple of things that have called my attention, especially different issues. One, something that you've mentioned marginally, but that really interests me, which is this idea that current accounts could be driven by capital flows instead of the other way around. Or at least simultaneously, that causality doesn't only run from current accounts to financial accounts, which is, I agree with you, sort of sometimes implicitly, but basically what's the mainstream perception of causality between those two sub-balances. Actually, it's something that not only I think it's worth exploring, it's something that I've been thinking about for couple of years now, and what I would like to ask you, because I have been thinking about it precisely, explicitly for Spain, sort of the causal relationship that comes to my mind between financial accounts to current accounts could be related. This is a question that I posed to you. Could be related to the literature on about too much of a good thing, like. It's the literature on emerging countries in the 90s, I don't know, Goldstein and Montiel would write about these things, you know, how capital inflows would be the cause or the origin or one of the causes of macroeconomic imbalances, in particular current account problems. So could this be sort of the, you know, narrative worth pursuing? That's one question. Another question, all related to this, another question is, you say that you have found no literature regarding this for the euro crisis, or more like theoretical approaches?
No, I mean discussing the euro imbalances.
I agree. Euro. I haven't found anything there. The closest thing that I have found, but it's not exactly about this. It's a paper by Osfeld in 2013. Which does link capital inflows to financial fragility, but not so much to macroeconomic imbalance. It's not so much the current account. See what I mean? Like the too much of a good thing literature would say that there's two problems related to capital inflows. One, the current account problem, and another one, the financial or the banking fragility problems. And the Osfeld paper relates to the second one, but not to the one you were mentioning. So yeah. I agree, I haven't found anything myself. And more about this, although this I mean, I understand if you have nothing in the top of your head to answer me. How would this be explored empirically? Because I've seen it done for East Asia, for instance, and I see it done more with anecdotal evidence and, you know, logical arguing. Like, for instance, by Robert Wade has done this for East Asia, like trying to link the capital inflows to the macroeconomic imbalances. But I don't know. I don't know if anything else comes to your mind or how to do this empirically, not just logically, right? And the second area of, I'm going to be very brief, I'm very sorry to extend myself too much.
Sorry, did you want to say anything on your thoughts for Spain? To what extent you think, I mean, such that we do a two-way question and answers?
I don't dare, frankly. No, go ahead.
What are your thoughts on what the role was for Spain in terms of capital inflows?
My thoughts are, my hunch, but I just have I don't know how to explore this in a paper. My hunch is that many of the explanations for the crisis in Spain have dealt a little too much with like macro and financial imbalances.